Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Digital Health Unplugged. I'm Jordan Soloff, news reporter at Digital Health, and today we're going to be looking at the health innovation landscape, discussing key lessons from scaling innovation, the biggest blockers, and what needs to change in the future to unlock more potential. Delighted to be joined by Mindy Simon, co-director of the NHS Innovation Accelerator, and Elina Naydenova, co-founder and CEO of Feebris. Great to have you both. Mindy, can I come to you first? For those kind of watching or listening who may not be aware, can you explain kind of what the NHS Innovation Accelerator is and kind of what your overall purpose is?
Okay, great. Thanks very much, Jordan. As Jordan said, I am Mindy Simon. I'm one of the co-directors of the NHS Innovation Accelerator, or the NIA as we like to call it. We are an NHS England funded programme, and we're here to kind of accelerate the uptake and spread of proven high impact innovations across the NHS that are there to really benefit patients and the healthcare system as a whole. And I should say health and social care systems, not just the health system. So we support the NHS by doing the kind of really hard work of sourcing and assessing innovations and upskilling those innovators to address its challenges. If you think of someone within the NHS, they're going to be approached by many different innovations on a daily basis. And what we are here to do is make sure that there's a pool of innovations that if they've got a problem, they know they can turn to us and say, this is what I'm trying to address, and we will hopefully have an innovation that can address it.
Great. And Elina, I'm sure there's lots of people watching and listening who know what Feebris is, but for those that don't, could you kind of explain kind of what you do and also kind of when you got involved with the NIA and how that's helped you?
Absolutely, and lovely to join you today. So I'm Elina, CEO and co-founder of Feebris. Feebris is an AI-powered platform for healthcare in the home. So we operate across the care continuum from proactive management of health needs in residential settings, which could be people living at home or people in care homes, the whole way through to acute management of health issues. So powering virtual hospitals alongside the NHS trusts that we have across the country. And we currently operate across 250 plus sites across the country. So that's social care providers as well as NHS providers. And what we've learned over the last couple of years is that we very much need partners on our side like the NIA to help us kind of spread the word, get the visibility and also the evidence base required to transition from what I believe the NHS knows how to do very well, which is pilot and instigate innovation through to what's a little bit more difficult, which is scale and transition into business as usual, particularly when we talk about new care models.
Great, thanks. So we're talking about kind of scaling innovation in the NHS. Obviously, you've both kind of seen kind of firsthand how that works. What would you both say are the kind of key lessons that you've learned or the kind of non-negotiables you need, I guess, in order to be successful?
I think you need to make sure you've got a lot of evidence. I think one of the things is you need to be able to prove that you are something that's going to save the NHS money, help patients' lives. It's not just a nice to have. The NHS does not have extra cash. It needs to be something that will do a lot more than is currently being done. They will not redo an entire pathway to have something that changes one very small aspect. So the first instance, as an innovator, when you're thinking of an innovation, don't just look at who's going to be your direct competitor or who you think isn't going to do as well as you. Think about who's doing as good enough as the NHS will need. And I think that's one of the biggest things I see is a lot of innovators come and they've got these amazing innovations, but they don't do that much more than what's already being done. There's no real productivity gain. There's no real financial gain. So the biggest thing for me is at the start, think about what is your innovation going to do that's so much better than anything else.
Great, yeah. Elina, anything else in terms of key lessons that maybe you've learned
Yeah,
from scaling?
I have so many over the last few years. We've accumulated quite a few of those.
I bet, yeah.
Maybe first, just building up on Mindy's point, I think the NHS is very good at piloting vertical solutions, but these do not scale in the NHS because we have a very complex system that really only scales platforms. So it's relatively, exciting, to Mindy's point, for innovators to build something very specific that might be absolutely transformative for a very specific part of the care pathway or a very specific cohort of patients. But in the current environment, only platforms can really deliver the financial or efficiency gains that the health system needs in order to survive and redefine the care model moving forward. So that's definitely one. The other one we've learned is kind of counterintuitive, but the effort required to secure and implement a small pilot is pretty much the same as the effort required to implement large-scale programs. So there isn't really a linear evolution in kind of the resourcing and the demand on both your operations and sales parts of the business. So that's something that innovators very much need to factor in. We've also learned, interestingly, that I think the NHS is a little bit of an interesting market where first mover advantage doesn't really work and count for much. Quite the opposite. In fact, the things that scale are typically the very well thought through solutions that have taken the time to earn the trust and generate the evidence base, to Mindy's point, and might be counterintuitive for other industries, and particularly for investors thinking about healthcare in the UK market. But the NHS is a long-term game. You need to really generate that evidence and also earn the trust in the right ways to have the right to scale. And then probably the final one for us is you always need to have at least 3 champions on your side. You need to have definitely an economic buyer, a clinical champion, and an operational champion.
Great.
Yeah, one of the things, Elina, I think is kind of alluding to in that is there's a lot of culture in the NHS. There's very much the people who make decisions are humans. So they want to make sure you've got to convince them that that innovation is worth using. And to do that, you need to have those champions. You need to have those people. But culture is so important. And if you ignore that as a factor, then you're quite frankly not going to get anywhere in the NHS.
Absolutely, yes, good point. So those are some of the key lessons. What about the kind of the barriers, the blockers to adoption and the scaling of innovation in the NHS? What would you say are the kind of the biggest obstacles that you see?
Oh, Jordan, what isn't an obstacle?
I know.
And I was thinking of this beforehand. I was thinking to myself, which part is the biggest obstacle? I don't think there's a biggest obstacle. I think there's so many different obstacles that when you get through one, you think I've gone far, but then there's another one's going to hit you. I think right now, if I was thinking of something, what's probably really predominant in my mind is the kind of institutions that are supporting the NHS, so like NHS England, the government, etc. I think they are one of the biggest blockers. I think some of the regulations they come up with do not support SMEs. They do not support things that are working within this country. They kind of support bringing in big organizations from outside the country. And that doesn't look well for me. I think if you think of what's happening with the NHS app at the moment, and they're saying they're going to be the kind of front door, fantastic idea. But the way they're thinking of doing that is by recreating stuff that's already out there, rather than bringing in these small SMEs that have already done it. They've already tried. They've already done everything that needs to be done to prove themselves. But yet the NHS app is thinking, I'll do it again all of a sudden. And I just think that is a massive barrier where they're not horizon scanning for what's out there already and how they can integrate. I think sometimes one of the biggest blockers is people who just want to make their name for themselves. So they want to create something new to say, I've done something new. And that for me is you need to take the egos out of it. So I think very much that culture piece of I want to do something different when different isn't the right piece is wrong. I think that needs to change. And I think the government organizations and the regulators need to support that. But right now, I don't think they're doing that. And then the funding needs to flow. So the government needs to put in place support for SMEs to come in and actually, when they've piloted, as Elina said, piloting is super easy. No, that's a lie. Piloting is easier than getting procured because you've tested yourself, you've proven yourself, but then there's no money at the end. There's no money and there's no kind of real pathway. And I think government and regulators need to support that. And I think right now the support that SMEs are getting is dire.
Yeah. Elina, any other kind of blockers or barriers that maybe you've experienced?
Yeah, definitely. So one that we've consistently seen is uncertainty. And that could be uncertainty in messaging, exactly what Mindy's talking about, like what is the role of the NHS app, for example. It could be uncertainty in structure, the abolition of NHS England, but on what horizons, what does it look like, etc. And the reason why that's a big blocker to adoption is because startups and innovation companies generally very well geared up to be agile, so they can evolve around change. What they can't evolve around is the system being paralyzed by that uncertainty, and the people that work in the system not feeling like they can make any decisions because they don't know what the direction of travel is for tomorrow, let alone long term. So that's definitely been a very significant blocker. The other one from our perspective is when process starts to be used as a blocker rather than as an enabler. And that could be anything from, governance to GDPR compliance, medical regulation compliance, whatever it is. I think these processes are very important for us to have a safe and effective system, and they're there for a reason. They should just be used to figure out what the right solutions are to then scale those solutions rather than ways to just consistently say no. Because whatever, we might actually have an economic argument for why we don't want to scale something, and we're just weaponizing process to make that argument. So both of those, I think, are quite significant when we talk about scale in particular.
Yeah. So we've got those lessons that talked about those barriers. What would you say is the most common pattern you see in innovations that do scale in the NHS versus those that maybe stall a little bit?
That's a funny question, Jordan, because you know what? I've not seen, in 10 years of doing this, I've not seen one thing that's worked for everyone.
Yeah.
It's been different for every single innovation. I think longevity is probably the most important thing, to be able to sustain yourself for years. You're not going to hit the ground running right away. It's not like you're going to suddenly get loads of contracts within your first 2 years. That's really unlikely unless your innovation is following the tide of whatever is being done at that point in time. Because I don't think it's really NHS that dictates what's being taken up. It's really what's happening politically, because it's the government that dictates what your priorities are. So if you're on the government side, when you can't predict that, then you might get scaled that a little bit quicker, but it's never more than 2 years. I would say you need to be able to say 5 years, 5 to 10 years is really your kind of scaling space. And every single one is different, because if you think of all the different doors are different. So some might be procured through the ICB, unlikely, like a full ICB kind of rollout. You might be procured by a specific one provider, one trust, one specific area. And I haven't seen any of them that managed to replicate it every single time. It's mainly been done through probably having advocates, so having people who will say that you're really good innovation and you've got the case studies and the evidence. But the one thing that all of them have had is really good evidence to say that they can do it. They've got some really good pilot data to support any of their claims. That's probably one consistent thing, is that evidence base. But everything else, all of the front doors, all of those pathways, changes every single time.
Yeah. And Elina, obviously, when we're talking about innovation, scaling innovation in healthcare, Feebris is very much a success story. I wanted to ask what is it about Feebris you think that has allowed you to scale so successfully? And are there any kind of practical examples or kind of success stories that come to mind that you can share that you think might help others that might be looking to kind of follow in your footsteps?
I would say probably not too dissimilar to the point Mindy made, particularly around resilience. I think if you go into this sector thinking that things are going to happen overnight, or you can follow a classic VC trajectory, you're going to be disappointed very quickly, because it's incredibly unpredictable and also doesn't scale fast. So building the resilience, and that's both financial as well as the human resilience in the teams doing the work on the ground, is incredibly critical. The businesses that have scaled and survived are the ones that have both of these things. And the other thing that I've seen is, it's a little bit counterintuitive, but pressure is probably the biggest enabler of change in the NHS. And that could be the pressure that we had during the pandemic, where we simply didn't have a choice and had to do things differently. It could be the current financial pressures that the system is facing, and that just push providers to the limit and force them to think differently, because we simply do not have the same level of resource that we had before. And it's quite human, to be honest. When you run out of options, you kind of start to think differently. And I think it's the combination of those two things that make innovation successful in the NHS in particular. Having the resilience to survive the storms that just keep on coming, and then equally leveraging these storms to drive adoption of innovation, particularly when it comes to new care models in the NHS.
Great, thanks. We'll talk about now about kind of the ecosystem of industry, NHS, academia, regulators. How do you think that has evolved and hopefully improved over the last few years?
I'm going to go a positive one, because I think sometimes I can feel a bit negative about it. I think one of the positive things I have personally seen is around academia and around them trying to make sure that something that's created in their lab is actually pushed out to patients at some point. A really good example of that would be like UCL Partners, one of the health innovation networks. They're working with their kind of academic partners to create a kind of invention arm. So to make sure that what's actually being done by the scientists, and that is actually being done within the NHS, as in like on the wards, etc. If somebody comes up with a really good innovation, that they're going to support them to go from idea all the way through to actually being pushed out. I think that for me is a real positive. I think there could be more of that. And I think if they can make a good example of it, maybe they can help roll that out. Industry, I think, would love to be more part of it, but it depends on what industry you're talking about. If you're talking about the little SMEs, innovation, places that are creating health innovations, great, like Feebris, fantastic. I think they are the absolute backbone of the NHS. Without them, we would not be able to run the NHS, and I don't think they're celebrated enough. If you're thinking of industry as in like pharma, etc., they would love to do more, but there's a conflict of interest. And I'm personally one of the people who thinks, great if they could throw their money at us, but I'm not necessarily going to want to change the NHS to support their kind of commercial aspects. The regulators, I think we've talked about already, I think they're not doing enough, or I think their intentions might be there, but they're not thinking of the unintended consequences of some of the things they're doing. Like the Procurement Act, again, when you read it through, it sounded like a really great intention. But when you looked at the fine print, it was really tailored towards larger organizations. And those are not the small SMEs that are the backbone of the NHS. So I think there's a lot that can be done that isn't being done by the kind of bigger ecosystem, but we should all band together to make it happen. Because if we're not going to do that, then I don't see how the NHS is going to survive.
Yeah. Elina, anything to add there?
Yeah, so I've been running Feebris for the last 6 years, but prior to that, spent time in academia doing a PhD at Oxford. Before that, spent time working in population and public health, etc. So my perspective has shifted both in terms of the types of organization and industry that I've been in, as well as the times that have changed, and particularly the way we feel about technology and AI. And what I've observed is that we're kind of following the typical innovation curve that starts with acceptance. So do we accept that tech and innovation is inevitable, and it's actually the only way we can scale our health systems, particularly given the aging populations and the challenges that they come with? Kind of moved past that point. And I particularly feel when I was in academia, we were stuck on the acceptance stage and we needed to really convince ourselves. this needs to happen. We're now in the second stage, which is adoption. So kind of changing the minds of individual users, redefining the individual workflows. And it's quite tedious, unsurprisingly at the moment, because you do need everyone to coalesce around this being a transformation that we need to go through. And then eventually we're going to enter the acceleration stage. And I feel like in this country, we have a lot of the right ingredients, including the NHS as a system, and some of the enablers like the NIA. What we do miss is a good practice of translating evidence into decision making. And that's what we need for the acceleration process. And I really hope that over the next couple of years we can crack this one, because if we don't, we're going to continue to lose innovation to the US and many other markets that are a little bit more attractive and better at cracking that final bit, the acceleration.
Great. Yeah, both your answers flowed nicely into the next question, which was kind of what's missing at the moment, and I guess what's the one key change you think that needs to be made in the next decade or even sooner to kind of unlock that full potential of health innovation?
I'd love to see a big roadmap that gets stuck to. I'd love to see government come together with discussions with SMEs, with the actual people on the ground who know what they're talking about, the health innovation networks, the innovation service, NHS England, which will be disbanded shortly, Department of Health. We've got a lot of knowledge, a lot of really good people out there who've got that information. I would love to see us all band together to create a roadmap of where innovation can be. Not everybody in the system working on its own little patch and then that crossing over, that duplicating. Right now, there's far too much duplication. There's not enough integration. There's not enough working together. What would be amazing is if we could have that larger look at what could happen, and that is stuck to. That the politicians, when the new governments come in, don't just decide to rip that up and change it, because change isn't made in a day. It's not made in your 4-year term. It is made on a long term. That 10-year plan the NHS came up with would have been a 10-year plan that could have worked if it had the government backing, but it doesn't, because the governments will change. What would be great is if politically everybody got on board and we created something that will work in the long term.
Elina?
Yeah, unsurprisingly, as a supplier of innovation, I would say we need to fix the procurement process. It is really not fit for purpose, and it's definitely not fit for the future. And it's everything from the timelines. So to give you an example, one of our customers recently was doing a presentation that just made me laugh. They were saying the procurement process took us 13 months because committees and committees and committees. And then the deployment process, which is at scale, so multiple hospitals, multiple clinical pathways, thousands and thousands of patients, took us 6 weeks. There's something very wrong if the balance of the thing that really matters is a fraction of what we actually waste our time on, which is the procurement. And the same goes to the fact that it's very counterintuitive for anyone that doesn't work in the NHS. This would make absolutely no sense. But there is currently no meaningful mechanism for NHS organizations that are procuring a specific type of innovation to learn from each other. So you're not allowed to, I'm not allowed to go to Mindy and say, hey, have you used this app? Did it work for you? What worked? What didn't work? Can you give me a specific recommendation that I can act on? So the NHS just keeps repeating the same mistakes over and over and over again. The number of times we've heard the statement of, this specific supplier didn't work for us, but, the patch next door decided to try, as if we're going to reinvent the wheel and discover completely different takeaways. And the reason why I think this is very unhealthy and very detrimental is because in the user's mind, we start conflating suppliers with a tech category. It's like saying this brand of fridge didn't work, which is why we're not going to use fridges anymore. We're just going to go to the shop every day. And that's something we really need to fix if we want to have a vibrant and sustainable innovation landscape in the NHS.
Yeah, absolutely well said. Before we come towards the end now, before we get on to kind of the NIA's launching its new cohort on Rewired a little bit. I want to come back to you, Elina, just in terms of Feebris, is there anything kind of coming up that you'd like to share, or kind of what excites you for the rest of 2026 for Feebris?
The thing that excites me the most is people really starting to think about system transformation. So we have many of those programs of work going on around the country, both in England, Northern Ireland and Scotland, where we've now moved past the point of individual clinical pathways or individual workflows to how do we look at our sustainability equation, and that's both financial, environmental, as well as workforce, and the burnout that the current model is costing them. How do we rethink this and then use technology as the enabler and as the connective tissue that makes the change possible? I think that's a very different landscape to where we were, particularly during the pandemic, actually, where we had very narrow and specific directives on implement this in this very specific way. So 2026, incredibly excited to keep generating that evidence that shows how the sustainability equation has completely transformed for all the partners that we work with.
Brilliant. So by the time this episode comes out, we'll be just a week away from Digital Health Rewired 2026. Very exciting. Mindy, you'll be there, and the NIA will be launching its next cohort of fellows at the event. What can you kind of tell us about this new cohort, and what kind of innovations and technologies are you seeing kind of come through?
Sadly, Jordan, I can tell you absolutely nothing about the new cohort. I'm held to silence until the 25th of March. Sorry, I'm so sorry. I can tell you we've got some great innovations coming through. I am super excited by all the ones I've seen. And to be honest, I'm super excited by all the applications we got, because even if they weren't ready for us, we got some great innovations to support the kind of pipeline work for innovations in the future. And what we've done is anybody who's applied to us, we're actually signposting them to what's their next steps, even if it's not us. And I think that's great. It's good to see that there's new stuff being generated all the time. And Rewrite is such a great conference. It's been fantastic for us, not just to launch our innovations, but actually it was a great way to meet lots of innovators last year and actually connected with people within the system. So I'm excited by that. I sadly cannot tell you anything more about my new cohort. I would have loved to have revealed lots of them.
Just tell
Grab
people
me afterwards.
We'll have to tell people we'll have to come to Rewired as well to find out more. So
definitely.
If you're listening to us now, Rewired is just a week away. It'll be 24th and 25th of March back at the NEC in Birmingham. Still time to register and come along. Packed program across the 2 days. I think we're about 10 stages. Also have the live final of Pitch Fest, our annual competition for startups, taking place on day 2. Elina, I think Feebris, did you take part a few years ago, Pitch Fest?
Quite a few years ago we did indeed.
Yeah. Time flies, yeah. But yeah, we had some great success stories from startups who've either won or just competed in Pitch Fest. So another great live final awaits there. And yeah, we look forward to the events. That's it for this episode. Thanks very much to Mindy and Elina for joining me. Thanks everyone for listening or watching. Our next episode will be recorded from Rewired. So see you in Birmingham.